All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Hypo Driver channel again. It's been a while. I wanted to make a video talking about something a little different from what I typically do, which is data analysis. Those of you that know me, those of you that have seen the car, been on track with me, know that I'm a huge fan of DSC Sport. I feel like I should say right up front, like I'm not a paid spokesperson or sponsored by them or anything. Frankly, it's a product that I've been working with since they had really a beta product for the C7 Corvette back in 2015, and honestly, they've just been awesome to work with. And Mike Levitas and Tom Chan, they've given me so much help. I mean, the amount of insight and time they've spent just helping educate me. What I wanted to do is kind of give some of that back and talk a little bit about a couple lessons learned from you using the DSC Sport controller, as well as kind of some tips for how to tune your shocks, or how do you tune the controller really. So um, there's a lot of folks that kind of get overwhelmed by the complexity of the software and seeing all the settings and not knowing where to begin. There's also some folks that have had some really bad experiences with kind of bad tunes. And I'm going to talk about that up in the beginning here too, and kind of walk you through some common problems. But really, the idea was kind of demystify this, simplify it, and really talk about how do I go about tuning my car with the DSC Sport controller. And currently, I have the DSC Sport controller and the tractive shocks, but this is going to be focused on the controller. And I'll also say, while they make products for lots of different cars, I'm really going to be focused on the GM stuff. So it's the C7 Corvettes, the Camaros, the V Series Cadillacs, all the things with MR shocks, because there's a few things that are unique to that platform, mainly around the PTM settings. And I kind of focus on that in particular and talking about how you go around tuning and setting these things up. So first thing I've done is I've just opened up the controller. I opened up the software, the DSC Sport tuner software. I've loaded up an old default tune I had sitting around. It's worth noting that if you're going to kind of venture down this path, I like to keep a library with notes of what I've done. So, like with my data files, I've got folders, and under tunes, I've got them by year, and you can go back and see, well, here's the baseline, here's some changes that Mike made. Here's one that I thought was good. So I kind of add stuff to the names, and keep these things by year, so I can kind of go back and look at what the configs were, or the calibrations were, is really the correct term, over time. And more than once, I've gotten to a point where I kind of ran down a rabbit hole, and the car wasn't doing what I wanted to do after a bunch of changes, and I literally would just go right back to step one and start with their default cal and go from there. And that's something that I really want to stress, because there's a lot of a kind of confusion about, well, how can they have the same cal for a Z06 and a Z07, or how can they have the same cal for two cars that have different springs? And I think the first thing that's worth just pointing out is it is a dynamic system, right? This isn't like you went and bought a set of Penske's and you've got a clicker on it for rebound and compression, or high speed and low speed. Like, this is a system that's going to modulate the strength of the shock based on the inputs, based on the G forces, based on your braking, based on your velocity. And we'll walk through what all that means, but it's worth recognizing that the shocks themselves are different from car to car too. So part of why you can get away with this same cal for two cars with different spring rates is because the shocks themselves are different. So if you look at like a Corvette, C7, Z07, the orifice in the shock that the fluid goes through is smaller. So even at full soft with the magnetic fluid, it's going to be stiffer than the shocks in a Z06. And as you add an amperage and you thicken up the fluid, it's going to progressively get even stiffer. So that's part of why you can get away with having the same or very similar calibrations across different cars. And like I said, a big part of it too is just that it's going to dynamically change based on the inputs you put into it. But the focus here is really going to be on, all right, you're not happy with something in the way the car's handling, where do you look? So the first thing I would do is, this is kind of specific to the GM stuff. There's been a few cals that have been posted and shared that had problems with them. And what's happening is there's some tables that other platforms don't have that the C7 has. And so let's start by just looking at the software. I'm going to go into settings. I'm entirely going to be focused on track usage here. This is I'm not really worried about street performance. These are for track cars, track settings. So I want to see chassis track. I want to rate to chassis track. And there's a couple things I want to show you. So first off, we'll talk about how we change things later, but check your tables like PTM. The PTM should be something like 50-50 in all four boxes. Here you've got rain where it softens the front. But I've seen folks that have put a controller in their car, loaded a calibration, and they're like, the car is complete garbage, the controller is junk, and I don't know how it's happening, but they'll pull up like their cal and we'll look at it, and it'll be all zeros. All zeros here is effectively telling the car, if you're in a PTM mode, just run the shocks full soft all the time. So obviously it's not going to handle well. Similarly with things like the speed tables, again, these are modifiers. We'll talk about them. The Excel table, acceleration, braking. Again, sometimes you'll see cals where these things somehow got zeroed out. They shouldn't be zeroed out. And if they are, then that's probably the first thing. That's the first thing I would change before messing with anything else in the calibration file. So having said that, let's talk about what do I do when I go to the track and I want to modify the way the car is behaving. It's worth noting that my car right now, the car I call the GSR, it is very different than the stock car, not just motor and transmission. I'm running the tractive coilovers. The car weighs significantly less in the front. It weighs significantly less overall. So spring rates are off from using coilovers. So I've got my own challenge of just trying to get the spring rates in the right ballpark to where shock tuning will actually help me. But all that said, here's the things that I will play with as far as shock cals when I'm at the track. So starting at the beginning, the first thing actually, let me show you one more thing. So this is a little bit of a trick. If you're trying to compare calibration files, the tooling is not great for that. You can use Notepad and write stuff down. You can, just kind of load stuff up and hope you remember. One thing I like to do if I'm comparing stuff is you can actually open a second instance of the tuner software and open up another calibration file. And now you can do things like actually look at them both and say, is that the same? I guess it is the same. Or, I wouldn't compare things directly and I'm not having to bring up a file, make notes on a notepad, bring up the other file, then transpose things. This is much easier because you can look at them side by side. I have my resolution kind of wonky right now just to try to make this readable for you. But when you've got a modern resolution, obviously you could put 2 or 3 of these things running side by side easily. So that said, I get to the track, and what I'm not going to focus so much on is the basics of shock tuning or the basics of suspension tuning, right? So, typical wisdom is things like, if you want more oversteer, stiffen the rear. If you want more understeer, stiffen the front. All these things you'll find in any suspension, tuning book. You got to understand those basics of what changes do I want to make to the shock behavior to have the car behave a certain way. But the place I always start is with these PTM modes. These are freaking awesome for me. As long as you're out on track and you're running in a PTM mode, what you can do is you can actually have multiple tunes that you can flip between while you're out there. So in a normal sense, Sport 1, Sport 2, Sport Race, you see in these cells, it's 50, 50, 50, 50. So that means effectively no change to the shock calibration and what the software has come up with at any given time. 50 is a midpoint. What you can do is, let's say I wanted to stiffen up the rear and see how the car behaved. I could do 60 in the rear, PTM race, and maybe in Sport 2, I want to do even bigger change, or maybe I want to go the other way. Maybe I want to soften the rear. I'll do 30 and 30, and then I'll leave Sport 1 at 50-50. So I can put it in PTM Sport 1, go out on track, do a couple laps, just twist the knob, Don't have to press any buttons. Just twist the PTM knob, flip it into Sport 2. Now I'm running a tune where I have effectively 40% softer, in this case, rears. So every 10% change is roughly like taking 20% out of the shock table. So you can do things like go out and literally have 3 different setups and run them back to back. Like do 2 laps, flip it, do 2 laps, flip it back, do 2 laps, do the other one 2 laps. And being able to do this gives you and you can do big swings too. So you could do, full soft if you wanted to, and get a real feel for how the car is responding to the shock changes. So for me, this is super cool. This is really something that I find very useful, and is my primary go-to to figure out where I want to go with the shocks. Okay. So let's say I've done that and I've determined that, I want to stiffen the front shocks. Now, the next place I would go, if I got a change that I know works and I want to have it work holistically, I go to the shock calibration. So if you go here, these are for the stock MR shocks. Those shocks really go from 0 is full soft. I believe 1,000 is actually full stiff. There's some method to the madness of why it goes up to 1,100 in the cal, and I think that's actually just to kind of keep it up against the full firm up near the end here. But if I decide that I want the fronts to be stiffer, I could do things like clear these values. So what do we have now? 0 or 100, 1100, 100, 1100. So I guess one of those times where it's helpful to have a notepad. But let's do a clear all. Clear all the entries. And the first thing I'm going to do is put these back in where they were. So 100, 1100. So I didn't hit update. Software's a little wonky. You got to enter the number and hit update. Here, I'll do 100, update, 100, update. Now on the fronts, I'm going to also cap it at 1100, so that's full stiff. No change there. Let's say I want those shocks to be stiffer through the entire range. So I might start here at, as opposed to 100, I might try 500. Now you do fill empty, and yep. And now what you've got is a front shock that's starting out stiffer. And so as it progresses through its range, as it's commanding a value, so let's say 50%, which is that kind of neutral value, it's 800 in the front and it's 600 in the rear. So that's one way you can kind of just like stiffen the shock up altogether. That for me is an easy way to do this because I mentally can wrap my head around it. The next thing I would say, if you're running, particularly if you're running with everything off on track, so if you're not using PTM modes. So again, with the GSR, I don't use the PTM modes much because the car is just a little far removed from the original programming. So what you can do is instead of using the PTM modes, you can actually do sport and track and tour as different variations on sport. So as an example, here you see where, showing editing tables for track and track. I could take this new change I made and write it to sport. So I won't do this here. I'm actually hooked to a controller, but I could effectively write my track suspension settings that I just modified to sport. So similarly, if I'm not in PTM, if I have, active handling and traction control turned off, I can flip it between sport and track out on track and get a feel for how the suspension is different. Now, sport and track change other things in the car. They change throttle response. You can override so I do this, I override the suspension and the exhaust settings so they're always in track mode all the time. You can do that in the dash on the car, but you will have a difference in throttle mapping, so I'll have to adapt to that. But again, it's a real nice way to go out and do 2 or even 3 different suspension setups that are across all the settings and be able to try them back to back on track. So for me, that's something I love to do. Now, the last piece here is the velocity. I don't do a lot with the velocity. Frankly, I know Mike Levitas does a lot with this. He's super helpful as far as providing input, but I want to kind of go over how this works a little bit. Tom Chan did a great video on DSC's website, goes through all the settings, soup to nuts. But this is a place more often than not that when I call up Mike and I go, Mike, the car is loose on corner exit, he will basically recommend something in the velocity. So I'm a little bit newer to this. For me, it's harder to think through, but let's kind of look at this table and look at what it is. So this table is a modifier for what the car would normally do. So if you go over and you think about the car's taking inputs, it's got G forces. They're going to drive a percentage of the shock calibration table. The PTM table will also potentially drive a modifier to that shock calibration table. You also have speed, accel, and brake. I don't do much with these unless I've got a very specific problem. But velocity is also a modifier based on how fast the shock is moving. So this is very much like you making the changes with the old style clicker shocks. So, compression is, resistance to the shock getting shorter. So low speed, I think about as you leaning into a corner and, again, the shock's trying to hold the car up a little bit as it's moving slowly. High speed is you hit a bump, like how fast or how hard is that car, trying to push back against the curb or the bump in the track. And then medium, I think about more as, real quick transition movements. So not quite a nice smooth turn in, but more like a quick transition in the middle of a corner or between corners. And rebound is just like with a regular shock. It's going to be resistance to, or it's going to be, if you will, the pressure pushing the shock down, if you will, making it extend more as the car unloads. So again, rebound, low is going to be a corner, or kind of cornering. High speed is going to be more of hitting a bump. So these are just modifiers. So you see, like we have a 10% increase under high compression. We have we have 10% in all of them. In this particular cal, we've got rebound, we've got 0, 0, 0. In the rears, whoops, that's the wrong table. In the rears, we actually have basically stiffness being taken out of the shock when it moves really fast. And not doing anything if it's moving really slow. So again, these are settings you really need to kind of take and think through, using like a standard kind of shock tuning mentality. How would you want it to manipulate the way the shock responds? But understand what it's doing under the covers is it's taking this and applying a multiplier, and that multiplier is then being added to the normal shock value that would get pushed into the car, pushed into the shocks themselves. So again, for me, tuning is I go PTM first. I find something I like, or I kind of know what I want. I'll go do shock calibration. If I got the shock calibration kind of close and I have something that's a little more dynamic, I'll play with the velocity settings. I would typically only work with the brake if I have something like issues with, getting into ice mode or getting it, the ABS kicking in too early. And maybe I want to change the balance of the car when I get heavy on the brakes to keep the nose from diving as much, or maybe let it do a little more weight transfer than it is. So I don't tend to use that much unless there's some really weird behavior I'm dealing with. But again, for me, the things that I love are being able to do this with just a laptop, but then also being able to go out on track and load up a couple different cals and go run your session and literally like real time, flip to one, flip to the other, flip it back. And you can basically, you should be able to feel a difference. And if nothing else, it gives you a way to kind of learn how the car is going to feel with different changes to the shock pressures. So I hope you all found this helpful. I'll say if you have questions about the DSC software, I know some. I've learned a lot. Mike Levitas has actually agreed to go do a follow-up seminar where we're going to actually do an interview style thing. So go ahead and post your questions up there. I'll kind of collect them up. We'll try to schedule a follow-up kind of interview, kind of podcast style thing with Mike to go through your questions and try to get them answered as well. But I hope you found this helpful, and thanks again for watching. Everybody have a great day.